Story 1. If the tariffs go away, the right-wing press will remain quiet about it, and his followers will assume that the tariffs worked. Mark my words. Story 2. I would like to see millions of lawsuits against the Trump government to recover all the illegally collected money they stole from people and corporations. Story 3. I am certain the Supreme Court will rule in Donald Trump's favor. Story 4. Frankly, I am surprised they have not realized that he will not follow any court orders. Story 5. Not to worry. His fully supported Supreme Court will overturn that quickly. Story 6. He just tweeted a short time ago, written by someone else, that tariffs would continue. The Supreme Court of the United States will support him. Story 7. It has destroyed several businesses and significantly affected economies in the United States and globally. It is time for retribution. Numerous lawsuits need to follow. Story 8. I think our country is very troubled and our president is an authoritarian leader. Story 9. My thoughts are, if they have been ruled illegal, end them immediately. It is a joke that a court says they are illegal but allows them to remain in place until mid-October. Story 10. It feels backward. If a court says they are unconstitutional, why are they still active? This only drags everything out and leaves regular people and businesses stuck paying the price while politics play catch-up. Story 11. I think that they are causing a lot of damage, especially to Americans. How many postal services are currently not delivering to the United States? 26. Story 12. Absolute nonsense. Now this maladministration can delay their appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. Story 13. The government will file an appeal, and the next court will consider it for as long as necessary. Story 14. I would like to see Donald Trump and the Republican Party be held accountable for all the economic damage they caused. Story 15. His tariffs are illegal. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States is so thoroughly compromised and corrupt they will give their leader what he wants. Story 16. It frustrates me, like almost everything that has happened this entire year. Story 17. They are undoubtedly unconstitutional. The ruling was made because they know the Supreme Court is no longer a legitimate institution. Story 18 sounds right. This is something Congress should be deciding, not the president. Story 19. It will not matter. The appeals court stated that the legal route taken was illegal, but there are other legal routes, so those will be taken. Also, the Supreme Court will obviously side with him, and if, in a surprising turn of events, they do not, he will ignore them and they will not do anything about it. Time and time again, he has shown that he will make things up and do his own thing. Repeatedly, those in power do nothing about it because it suits their needs at the moment. The problem is not him. The problem is everyone else who openly lets him do whatever he wants to avoid the tantrum. Story 20. It is the first step toward removing these unfair and unconstitutional tariffs. These unlawful tariffs will eventually be removed completely. It is not a matter of if, but when. Donald Trump used the tariffs to manipulate the markets for his own stock investment goals. When stocks were low enough, he bought low, then lowered the tariffs and watched the stocks rise so he could make a significant profit. Story 21. If you read the law or the Constitution, they are illegal. The law says you need an emergency, and Donald Trump just makes up an emergency. The Constitution says only Congress can impose tariffs. None of that matters. The Supreme Court will once again bail Donald Trump out and determine they are okay. Story 22. I think this relates to previous decisions stating that lower courts cannot issue nationwide injunctions and the president criticizing judges. Judges fear having their names, families, and careers damaged because of the president's ego. If he stops them, the market goes into further chaos. If he declares the injunctions illegal and stops them, he must deal with the consequences, knowing the issue will go to the Supreme Court. The president takes everything there because the new system is set up that way, and that is the only check on the power he believes has any authority over him. He allows the Supreme Court to make the final ruling, then responds with an unusual tweet and moves on. The Supreme Court can handle the harassment from the president. Story 23. Will we even notice the tariffs go away? It is like the COVID-19 and supply chain price increases that barely decreased. Chief executive officers will be like, well, I mean, people were paying this price anyway. We might as well keep it high and increase our profits some more. Story 24. A Supreme Court of the United States case is not a threat to Donald Trump. He welcomes it and opens the door for a significant new precedent that everyone will pay for decades. Story 25. It is unacceptable. Imagine a court saying, slavery is unconstitutional, but we will allow everyone to continue until my parents have weighed in on it, possibly a year or two from now. This is not a minor complaint. If the court rules that the government is violating the Constitution of the United States, then that must stop immediately. Story 26. People need to face consequences for a while. I hope the Supreme Court lets them stand. This is what people voted for. They will never learn if they do not face consequences. Release the Epstein files. Story 27. I am glad the federal courts are pushing back on unconstitutional executive actions. The president is not a king. This is clearly the domain of the United States Congress. Story 28. It is impossible for businesses, especially small businesses, to operate in this environment. Nobody knows what imported goods will cost tomorrow, let alone in 3 months. It is impossible to budget, price, and forecast demand. This is insane. Story 29. I think the United States system is very broken. The fact that it is so easy for a convicted felon and rapist imbecile to bully their way into office and cause havoc with the system, and in turn, the world, is appalling. Even if things are eventually corrected, the amount of damage done before the courts finally take action is shocking. The United States will never be great again. Instead of fixing the problems, they have doubled down on the failure. Story 30. The damage is already done. This is actually worse in some ways. We have proven as a country that we are not safe to do business with or inside. The dollar's place as the reserve currency is going away very soon. Story 31. These are all a drive to push the unitary executive. This idea has existed for decades. The increasingly diminishing popularity of the grand old party forced their hand. If they did not attempt it now, they would not have the power to go all in. Story 32. The corporations will get their money back, but we will not. The extra $50 I had to pay cash on delivery to get my sunglasses from the post office is not coming back. That money is already lining someone else's pockets. Story 33. I think it is example number 737290026 that the party that pretends to run on law and order does not care about law or order. Story 34. As always, I think that the odds are that we could choose an eligible citizen randomly to be president and not do worse than the current president for at least the next 500 years. Story 35. I am tired. I am tired of half the country bending over backwards at the whim of a person who was ineffective when fully capable. Story 36. More of the same. Apparently, former President Donald Trump can do anything with zero consequence. Thankfully, his unhealthy body still has some consequences. He is no god. Story 37. If they are illegal, how are we recovering our money? Story 38. This was the plan. The tariffs get rolled back. The government has to refund companies, but companies do not have to refund consumers. Boom, record earnings. Story 39. The individual is causing problems in America and the rest of the world. Shaking my head. Story 40. No one is going to do anything about it. Just like no one has done anything about all the crazy behavior he has displayed so far. That is how dictatorships work. Story 41. That Elon only lasted a few months says a lot. Orange Clown is in no way a successful businessman. He is going to bankrupt us just like he has done to himself. Story 42. I think the call on legality is right, but allowing it to continue is unacceptable. Story 43. So basically, unconstitutional but still enforced, sounds about right for United States politics. Story 44. The serial child molester already did his damage. It does not matter if the laws get repealed now. Even if the Supreme Court rules that they are unconstitutional, the serial child molester already did his damage. Story 45. Forget the Supreme Court. They do not need to be involved with 80% of the cases they hear and decide. Every single decision they dislike, they overturn, disrespecting the lower courts. Story 46. That is basically how all legal appeals work everywhere, both inside and outside of the United States of America. The decision that is being appealed is stayed pending appeal. This is not some underhanded act of defiance. It is the legal system. Story 47. The Supreme Court of the United States will give him whatever he wants. That is how a dictatorship works. Story 48. He is going to do whatever he wants, regardless of courts, because there is no responsible authority controlling him. Story 49. Force the government's hand nationwide to prevent the collection of tariffs. Story 50. Business needs certainty to operate. The on and off nature of everything is causing problems not just in the United States but worldwide. It is increasing prices for everyone, not just United States residents. It is ruining businesses everywhere. Until there is a final ruling, months away, this uncertainty will continue. And then what next? Maybe it is me, but could Donald Trump come up with something else? Story 51. The judge, like everyone else, is a coward. Make your ruling, then order the illegal activity to pause. If the Supreme Court of the United States overturns it, it's on them. Story 52. About time the court stepped in and blocked these unconstitutional power grabs. Story 53. He was serious. Story 54. I have no problem with it, and if the shoe were on the other foot, neither would Reddit. Imagine if we just started tearing down the Affordable Care Act when the appeals court struck it down, and then restored it once the Supreme Court ruled in favor. The Supreme Court needs to overturn the chief executive. Story 55. I assume if Donald Trump ever does not violate the Constitution, it is a coincidence. He does what he wants all day, every day, doing so many illegal things that it is impossible to stop it all. We are so far past the point where it should have been stopped at the source. Nothing makes sense anymore. Story 56. Well, 95% of what he is doing is unconstitutional. The problem is the lower courts are the only ones addressing it, and it eventually ends up at the Supreme Court, which is biased in his favor. Nobody will stop him until the people themselves take action. Story 57. I imagine the federal appeals court left them in place because the Supreme Court told them to, pending their own ruling. Story 58. Policy aside, I am not in favor of tariffs. 677 United States District Court judges having the ability to override the president does not make sense. Waiting to enforce the ruling until it reaches a higher court seems reasonable, especially when it is not a one-way door. Story 59. Appeals of ongoing processes mean that whatever was happening continues until the court process reaches its highest level and a decision is rendered. This is how it is supposed to work. Story 60. The president does not have explicit power to impose tariffs. Congress is supposed to have that power, but they have abrogated their authority and made themselves a mostly vestigial branch of government. I would like to believe that the Supreme Court would not want to render themselves useless by simply approving the president's actions, but they also seem to be taking the path of least resistance. Term and age limits now. Story 61. Well, it does not really matter when the United States Congress and the Supreme Court will approve anything he does. Story 62. He knows the Supreme Court will rule in his favor, so why bother stopping? Also, he just ignores the courts anyway. Story 63. I think it is very unwise. They remain in place until around October. Story 64. I think that every country should have free trade. All tariffs do is raise prices for everyone. Story 65. It says a lot when something is ruled unconstitutional yet still enforced. The system bends for power, not for justice. Story 66. I am absolutely livid that these policies were even instituted in the first place. Not just because it costs me and everybody else more for everything, but because they are lying to us by telling us that we don't pay the costs. I know what things cost. I know the price increase. Story 67. Donald Trump has significant influence over the Supreme Court of the United States. I am not surprised that the court is lenient toward him. I am actually surprised that they are hindering him in any way. Story 68. It is the right call, but I suspect that without congressional action, The Supreme Court will rule that former President Trump can claim anything is an emergency and allow these tariffs to continue. For some reason, conservatives believe a president is a god. Story 69. It is unreasonable. When the Supreme Court strikes down the tariffs, is Donald Trump going to repay all the tariffs that were illegally collected? I doubt it. Story 70. My thoughts are that I am tired of the administration trying to bypass the Constitution and the courts having to keep them in check. Sooner or later, he will figure out that he can fill the Supreme Court with yes men, and we will all be in serious trouble. Story 71. It makes sense to leave them in place until the final ruling, if only to keep the market stable. Being stable and challenged is better than unstable and challenged. The tariffs being unconstitutional makes sense, but we will see if the Supreme Court agrees. Story 72. The tariffs are not going anywhere. He will either do it anyway, or the Supreme Court will pull some president can do whatever he wants nonsense. Story 73. It will go to the Supreme Court, and they will rule that Donald Trump is a god and his will is all that matters. Story 74. The issue is that the Republicans control Congress. They could simply implement former President Donald Trump's tariffs, and it would be perfectly legal. It only takes a simple majority to do this, which they have. The filibuster and supermajority requirement is merely a rule the Senate imposes on itself. The issue is not tariffs. It is about a presidential power grab and following the Constitution. Story 75. Best case is they are removed and we can start trying to rebuild our global economy, but it is going to take decades, at least starting from today. Story 76. We need to stop calling these Trump's tariffs. Republican Party members allowed this to happen. These are Republican Party tariffs and should be referred to as such every time. Story 77. It makes sense not to stop them immediately. There is no reason for that kind of whiplash. Just go to the Supreme Court and obtain a final decision. Story 78. I think the average American man is weak and a coward, and this is the most disappointing timeline where no one can find their courage and do the right thing. Instead, people advocate for the opposite, encouraging selfishness and a me mentality, which only contributes to the decline of society. Every day, I am more grateful that I did not bring anyone here to suffer in this nonsense. Story 79. The low conservative class in the United States never cared about the rule of law except when it helped them, so I am not surprised. Story 80. My thoughts are that there is basically no rule of law at the highest level of this country. Donald Trump is going to continue to do whatever he wants, and the Republican members of Congress and the Supreme Court are going to continue to allow him. Story 81. It feels strange when something is ruled unconstitutional but still enforced, as if the system is stuck on pause until the Supreme Court decides. Story 82. The most modern American thing ever. Some things are illegal, but we will not do anything about it. There is a non-zero chance that the people who make the final decision can or will be bought or influenced to make a biased decision. Story 83. The court should have stopped them. If Donald Trump appealed and won, then Congress should step in and take charge of them, not him. Story 84. If the Supreme Court of the United States agrees with the appeals court, Donald Trump will become very angry. If they side with him instead, he will be an even bigger problem with tariffs. Story 85. If they are illegal and all that money has been collected, and we the people are paying for it through higher prices, then I believe we should take all revenue from illegal tariffs and split it evenly among all of us except Congress, the Senate, and every other elected official. They get theirs when they release the unredacted Epstein files, with the exception of victims' names. Story 86. Not surprising at this point. After following all of Donald Trump's cases over the past several years, I have seen the same thing play out repeatedly. Story 87. Fairly irrelevant. Donald Trump controls the Supreme Court. It will likely rule in his favor. If not, it will be good for everyone, but Trump will find another way to harm everyone in the long term. It would not change anything. Everyone is affected one way or another. Story 88. Every action being overturned by lower courts is intentional. They need these rulings so they can appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States for a final decision. The Supreme Court of the United States currently has a majority of Federalist Society judges on the bench. Once ruled on by the Supreme Court of the United States, these tariffs will be legal until enough justices die or retire, assuming there is an opposition left to appoint justices. Story 89. Trump imposing tariffs is like a petty child telling others they will not get any of his candy. Childish pettiness should have no place in the presidency of the most powerful country in the world. Story 90. Unconstitutionality would impact the White House, but it seems the administration has backup tariffs, such as announcing they will likely impose tariffs on furniture imports under a legal rule. It will take a bit longer, and probably some items will be exempt, especially things that cannot be sourced from the United States, such as bananas and mangoes. This assumes the Supreme Court does not take a middle course, as many supply chains have already changed. For example, they might rule that tariffs were unconstitutional under the administration's approval, but also state that Congress can approve all or most tariffs within a specific time frame, or they might not. Story 91. Do not worry, the Supreme Court of the United States will reverse that ruling. Story 92. I think the appellate judges know how corrupt the Supreme Court of the United States is. Story 93. It seems unreasonable that the tariffs were not paused after the court found them unconstitutional. Why keep them in place? Unfortunately, I understand that the steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada are not included in this ruling. The former administration is attempting to assert influence over Greenland and Canada. Can Canada declare a state of emergency? What options does Canada have in response to these punishing tariffs? How long can Canada endure these illegal tariffs? Story 94. Reminds me of the soda tax that Tony Preckwinkle tried to enact in Chicago. It was in place for a few months, then reversed. No real thoughts. Story 95. I think the judges are only doing half their job and relying on the Supreme Court of the United States to fix it. They are trying to do the right thing without putting themselves in the crosshairs of Section 47. Story 96. As with all court decisions, only the Supreme Court should have the power to overrule presidential orders. This was the argument during Trump's first term when he was stifled by the courts. We continued to argue the same point despite the president switching sides during the Biden years, and we still do now. Judicial oligarchy is a major problem. Story 97. Well, since the Supreme Court of the United States will find a way to make them legal, I guess it does not matter. Story 98. The wheels of justice move slowly. It is going to be tricky watching the Supreme Court of the United States try to validate Donald J. Trump's national emergency excuse, since it does not exist. Story 99. If the courts say they are unconstitutional, they should be suspended until the Supreme Court rules on the matter. Story 100. The entire tariff plan is harming our economy and causing job losses. Please tell me which middle-class American is benefiting other than repossession agents. Story 101. The normal way of handling disputes in court cases is usually to maintain the status quo while the courts resolve the issues. It seems unreasonable that this approach is not being followed now. Assuming the Supreme Court is rational and accepts the Court of Appeals decision, which is not guaranteed, this essentially means the United States government has taken billions of dollars from American companies and, through those companies' price increases from American citizens. Story 102. Rulings do not matter if there is no enforcement. Despite all the investigations, rulings, and court cases, Donald Trump has largely gone unpunished. Story 103. They are going to ignore the courts, especially if Vance is the supreme leader. Story 104. That is unfortunate because the Supreme Court has proven time and again that they are traitors who will throw democracy in the trash to please Donald Trump. Story 105. The Supreme Court of the United States will just overturn it and let Donald Trump do what he wants. Story 106. People with the biggest guns make the rules. I am not sure why people are still arguing about rules and constitutions when Donald Trump is setting up to get all the federal and state guns on his side before we crown him king in 3 years. Story 107. More lifelines, as always, from his sworn enemies, the radical left judges who wake up hating our poor burdened president. What will the Supreme Court rule on this? Story 108. Our vaunted checks and balances have no effect anymore. We do not have a two-party system anymore. One party has completely taken over, and this country is being run like a failing casino. The United States of America has been ruined by one awful man in less than a year. He had help, of course. The Supreme Court, Fox News, and millions of deluded followers. Story 109. Makes me wish President Joe Biden had the courage to implement student debt forgiveness. Story 110. I think using delays in the system, such as the time it takes to process a case through the courts, is intentional. Consider how he was elected to office the second time. Story 111. Wow, that's great. Now, if only some consequences would happen every time he ignored them. It's all bark and no bite. Hit him where it hurts, or he just makes his puppets block everything. Story 112. As long as they stay long enough for the western provinces of Canada to declare independence. Story 113. It is the best example of how the two political parties are just different flavors of the same thing. They spend all their time on television screaming about how different they are, but when it comes to large financial interests, corporate interests, and foreign policy, they are surprisingly similar. Story 114. Good. Judges who want to create laws from the bench should be disbarred. Story 115. Why would the Trump administration start abiding by judicial decisions now? Whatever happens, since they control all three branches of government, it will work out best according to their interests. Story 116. I don't think the global economy should sway unchecked based on if an Oompa Loompa wakes up on the wrong side of the bed. Story 117. The judge does not have this authority and is overstepping bounds. Story 118. If they are ruled illegal, the market will crash and we will enter a deep recession. Story 119. Oh, just stop with this Trump derangement syndrome nonsense. I am tired of this obvious childish whining and stupidity. Story 120. Trump is well within his authority. I thought they already gave an opinion on that. Lower courts are supposed to stay out of national politics. There are checks and balances, and it is not lower court judges who should rule. Story 121. Hello is doing what every president before him either did or talked about doing. He is doing what is best for the country. He has made deals with many countries, including Canada. Hopefully, factories return before he leaves office. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.